For 19 years, I never spoke his name. I built a life that didn't need it. Then, in a crowded room, the man who left me 8 months pregnant smiled, touched my son's shoulder, and declared, "This is my son." My boy didn't yell. He just delivered a reply cold enough to shatter the room. That night, I finally understood some debts do not come back to be forgiven. They come back to be exposed. My name is Scarlett Diaz. I was 29 years old, exactly 8 months pregnant, and standing in the cramped kitchen of a duplex in Cedar Ridge, Texas, when the earth gave way beneath my feet. It did not happen with a tremor or a deafening roar. It happened in the absolute, suffocating quiet of a Saturday morning. My feet were severely swollen, pressing painfully against the worn fabric of my cheap orthopedic sneakers. A dull, relentless ache radiated from my lower back, a constant reminder of the life pressing down on my spine. The morning light filtering through the cheap vinyl blinds was pale and weak. I was wrapping a turkey sandwich in foil, preparing for my 12-hour weekend shift at the Regional Insurance Processing Clinic. It was a perfectly ordinary morning. The coffee maker hissed and sputtered on the counter. The refrigerator hummed its familiar, off-pitch tune. I was calculating whether we had enough milk to last until Tuesday. Then, Graham Mercer walked into the room. He was my husband. He was the man who was supposed to assemble the crib, sitting in flat-pack cardboard boxes in the spare bedroom. But the man who stepped onto the faded linoleum that morning did not look like a father-to-be on a lazy weekend. He looked like a man walking into a boardroom to execute a hostile takeover. He wore a sharply ironed dress shirt, the cuffs perfectly rolled up to his forearms, and a pair of dark slacks. He smelled of his expensive aftershave, not the usual lingering scent of sleep and toothpaste. In his right hand, he carried a matte gray folder. His face was a mask of practiced neutrality. I recognized that expression. It was the face he wore when he practiced his performance reviews in the bathroom mirror, rehearsing the exact inflection of his voice to sound authoritative, yet entirely detached. There had been no arguments the night before. There were no smashed plates, no tearful confessions, no undeniable red flags waving in the wind. We had eaten baked chicken and watched a half-hour sitcom. We had gone to sleep. That was the most brutal part of the ambush. The sheer, unadulterated normalcy of the previous night made the sudden violence of his arrival into the kitchen so much worse. Graham stopped at the opposite side of the small wooden dining table. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not offer to pour me a cup of coffee. He simply laid the gray folder flat on the table, opened it, and slid a clipped stack of papers toward me. "I am filing for divorce," he said. His voice was perfectly steady. I stared at him, my hands still hovering over the aluminum foil. My brain simply refused to process the syllables. I thought, quite genuinely, that he was having a severe panic attack. The impending reality of fatherhood had finally crashed down on him, and this was his mind's way of short-circuiting. Men get scared. Men panic. I took a slow breath, ready to walk around the table, ready to rub his shoulders and tell him that we would figure it out together. "Graham," I started, keeping my tone gentle, "you are just overwhelmed. The baby is coming soon, and we are both tired." "I am not overwhelmed. Scarlett," he interrupted, his tone chillingly flat. "I am awake, and I realize that staying here, with you, with a child, will completely derail my career trajectory." The words hung in the stale kitchen air. Derail my career trajectory. He spoke about our unborn child as if it were a bad quarterly investment, a logistical error that needed to be swiftly corrected. My eyes dropped to the papers. The stark legal font blurred, but the bold headings were unmistakable. Petition for dissolution of marriage. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and flipped to the second page. My mind was scrambling, desperately trying to find the logic, the missing piece of the puzzle. "How?" I whispered. "How are you doing this? Where will you go? The lease is in your name." Graham adjusted his watch. It was a subtle movement, but it screamed of impatience. "I canceled the lease yesterday. We have 30 days to vacate. I have already accepted a senior director position at a firm in Phoenix, Arizona. My flight leaves at noon. The floor seemed to tilt. Phoenix? A new job? A canceled lease? This was not a sudden morning panic. This was a calculated, meticulously executed exit strategy. And the money? I asked, my voice sounding hollow, as if it were coming from someone else standing outside the room. I transferred my half of the joint savings into a private account, he stated smoothly. I left you your current paycheck, and enough to cover the utility bills for the month. My lawyer will handle the rest of the mediation. He had hollowed out our life from the inside while I was sleeping next to him. I looked at this man, the father of my child, and saw a complete stranger. Why? I asked. It was a pathetic question, but it was the only one my stunned brain could formulate. Graham sighed, a short, exasperated sound, as if he were explaining a simple concept to a slow employee. Because I was not born to live a mediocre life, Scarlett. I am not going to spend my best years trapped in a suburban duplex, struggling to pay for diapers and daycare, watching my ambitions suffocate under the weight of domestic obligation. You are content with this level of existence. I am not. There it was. The absolute truth stripped of all its polite disguises. I was a weight. The baby kicking against my ribs at that very moment was an anchor threatening to pull him down into the abyss of a normal, unexceptional life. I did not scream. I did not hurl the hot coffee pot at his perfectly groomed head. I did not fall to my knees and beg him to reconsider. A strange, suffocating numbness washed over me, freezing my blood and silencing my panic. It was a survival instinct kicking in, a primal understanding that wasting energy on tears would be a fatal mistake. I picked up the cheap plastic pen resting next to the grocery list on the table. I flipped to the back page of his meticulously prepared document. I signed my name. Scarlett Diaz. Not Mercer. Not anymore. As I slid the paper back to him, I looked up. And in that frozen fraction of a second, I noticed the most damning detail of all. Graham looked at the signature. He looked at my face. He looked at the kitchen door. But he never looked down, not once. His eyes stubbornly remained above my chest level. He flatly refused to look at my belly. He refused to acknowledge the physical evidence of the child he was abandoning. Looking at the bump would make it real. Looking at the bump would require a shred of humanity he was desperately trying to bury. So, he kept his eyes high, took the folder, and turned around. My lawyer will be in touch, he said to the doorframe. He walked out. The front door opened and clicked shut with a sickening finality. A minute later, the engine of his sedan roared to life, and the sound of tires rolling over the gravel driveway slowly faded into the quiet Texas morning. I stood alone in the kitchen. The silence rushed back in, but it was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, ringing in my ears like the aftermath of an explosion. Suddenly, a sharp, searing pain ripped across my lower abdomen. My breath hitched, and my knees buckled instantly. I slid down the front of the wooden cabinets, my heavy body hitting the cheap linoleum floor with a heavy thud. I clutched my stomach, my fingernails digging into the fabric of my maternity shirt. Terror, cold and absolute, gripped my throat. Not now. I prayed to a God I rarely spoke to. Please, not now. It is too early. I sat on the floor, my back pressed hard against the cabinets, breathing in short, ragged gasps. I waited for the next wave of agony. I waited for the water to break. I waited for the final catastrophe to strike. But the pain slowly receded, leaving behind a dull ache. The muscles relaxed. It was a false alarm, a Braxton Hicks contraction. My body was not going into labor. It was simply reacting to the sheer, unadulterated terror of being thrown into the wilderness. My nervous system was screaming, processing the shock that my brain was still trying to deny. I sat on that floor for a long time. The linoleum seeped the cold into my aching bones. I looked at the half-wrapped turkey sandwich on the counter. I looked at the empty space where the gray folder had been. I felt a heavy, distinct kick against my ribs. The numbness began to crack, threatening to let the hysteria in, but I could not afford hysteria. Hysteria cost energy, and I had exactly 0 to spare. I grabbed the edge of the counter and hauled my heavy body up. My joints popped in protest. I leaned heavily against the laminate surface, staring blindly out the window at the empty driveway. Next to the sink lay my old, battered spiral notebook. Its cover was torn, its pages filled with mundane reminders: buy laundry detergent, call the plumber, pay the electric bill. I reached for it. I picked up the same blue plastic pen I had used to sign the divorce papers. I flipped past the grocery lists and the budget calculations that no longer mattered. I found a fresh, completely blank page. The paper felt rough under my palm. I did not write a diary entry. I did not write out my pain or my fear. I pressed the tip of the pen hard into the paper, the blue ink bleeding slightly into the cheap fibers. I wrote 3 separate lines, 3 anchors to keep me from drifting into madness. Rent, formula, survive. The rain came down in relentless sheets the night my son was born. It hammered against the frosted glass windows of St. Anne Medical Center, a deafening drumbeat that matched the terrifying, pulsing agony radiating through my core. There was no husband pacing the sterile hallway outside. There were no anxious grandparents waiting in the lobby with flowers and balloons. The delivery room was stark, aggressively lit, and cold enough to make my teeth chatter between contractions. My only anchor in that isolating ocean of pain was a seasoned delivery nurse named Donna Reeves. Donna had kind, deeply lined eyes and hands that felt like warm, unyielding iron. When the final, tearing wave of pain peaked, threatening to pull me under entirely, I did not scream for the man who had vanished. I grabbed Donna's hand, squeezing until my own knuckles turned dead white, drawing borrowed strength from a complete stranger because that was the only resource I had left. The sharp, reedy cry that pierced the room minutes later was the most terrifying and beautiful sound I had ever heard in my life. The following morning, the administrative clerk brought in the standard registry paperwork. The official birth certificate felt infinitely heavier than the plastic clipboard holding it. The designated line for the father's name stared back at me, an empty, glaring white space demanding a history I desperately wanted to erase. I held the provided blue pen, its tip hovering over the empty box. For a long, agonizing minute, I seriously debated leaving it blank. It would have been so much easier to wipe the slate clean. But erasing him felt like a cowardly lie, and I completely refused to build my child's life on a foundation of omissions. I pressed the pen down and wrote his father's full name. I did not write it out of some pathetic, lingering delusion that he would somehow see the document, feel a sudden pang of remorse, and rush back to us. I wrote it because my son's permanent record needed to reflect the objective, unvarnished truth. Biology is an undeniable fact, even when the man responsible for it acts like a coward. However, when it came to the child's own name, I did not hesitate for a single second. I named him Mateo Diaz. Bestowing my own surname upon him was not an act of petty, impulsive revenge. It was a deliberate shield. It was a silent, ironclad declaration written in public ink that this boy would never grow up sitting by a window, measuring his worth by the presence or absence of a man who did not deserve his devotion. Mateo belonged entirely to me, and he belonged to the future we were going to build from the ground up. By the time Mateo was 2 months old, our new reality had settled into a brutal, bone-wearying rhythm. We lived in a cramped, drafty efficiency apartment situated directly behind a 24-hour commercial laundromat. The constant, rhythmic thumping of the massive industrial washing machines vibrated straight through our thin floorboards, becoming the bizarre, unavoidable lullaby of my son's infancy. The air in our tiny living space always smelled faintly of industrial bleach and cheap floral fabric softener. During the daylight hours, I worked as a data entry clerk at a local medical supply warehouse, typing endless strings of alphanumeric inventory codes until my vision blurred and my neck seized up. But a single income was nowhere near enough to keep the electric meter running and the specialized infant formula stocked in the cupboard. So, when the sun finally went down and Mateo fell asleep in his second-hand crib, I sat at a wobbly folding card table and worked my second shift. I processed remote medical insurance claims, squinting at complex billing codes well past 2 in the morning, fighting the heavy, narcotic pull of sleep with glasses of tepid tap water. It was during those solitary, deeply quiet hours of the night that I began to systematically build my archive. I purchased a cheap, expandable cardboard folder from the local dollar store and started keeping absolutely everything. I kept the exorbitant hospital bills from Mateo's complicated birth. I kept the official eviction notice from our old, comfortable duplex. I printed out the few, highly sanitized text messages his father had sent through his retained attorney regarding the absolute minimum legal requirements he was actively fighting to avoid. I kept every single grocery receipt for diapers, every minor pharmacy bill, every aggressive demand for rent, every single financial and logistical burden he was legally and morally supposed to help carry, but actively ignored, went straight into that expanding folder. I was not hoarding these papers out of a morbid, self-pitying obsession with my own misery. I was meticulously documenting the exact dimensions of the void he had left behind. The paper trail was my silent, irrefutable witness. There were nights when the sheer weight of it all nearly crushed the breath right out of my lungs. I remember one specific evening in late November, right as the Texas air turned bitterly cold. Mateo was burning with a high fever, his small, fragile body tossing restlessly in my arms, his cries weak and raspy. I opened my worn leather wallet to check what actual currency I had left before the next payday. I counted exactly $38.50 in crumpled bills and loose coins. The panic that seized me in that moment was not the sharp, sudden terror of the day I was abandoned. It was a dark, suffocating, heavy despair. I was a single mother, utterly and completely exhausted, holding a sick infant, with less than $40 to my name and 8 full days left until my next paycheck cleared. I laid Mateo down gently on the mattress, walked to the narrow kitchen counter, and opened my old spiral notebook. Beneath the original words I had written months ago, I wrote a new directive: keep going anyway. It became my singular prayer, my battle cry, the only religion I could afford to practice. I wrote it when the electricity provider sent a final disconnection warning. I wrote it when the soles of my only work shoes wore straight through to the pavement. Keep going anyway. I survived those brutal early years not through sheer, solitary willpower, but through the quiet, entirely unexpected grace of a neighbor. Mrs. Eleanor Pike was a widow in her late 70s who lived in the unit adjacent to ours. She moved deliberately, walked with a heavy wooden cane, and possessed a quiet, sharp dignity that instantly commanded respect. She saw the dark, bruising circles under my eyes in the hallway. She heard Mateo crying through the paper-thin drywall when I was too dead on my feet to soothe him immediately. She did not offer useless platitudes or pitying glances. Instead, she offered decisive action. 2 afternoons a week, she would knock firmly on my door, lean heavily on her cane, and simply state that she was taking the boy into her apartment for 3 hours so I could sleep. At first, my stubborn pride furiously resisted. I felt a desperate need to do it all entirely alone to prove I was not the useless burden I had been accused of being. But as I finally surrendered to the crushing exhaustion and let her help, I learned a profound, life-altering lesson. True dignity is not about stubbornly refusing a lifeline when you are actively drowning. Dignity is having the humility to accept the help, using it to pull yourself back to your feet, and ensuring you survive long enough to eventually pass that kindness forward. One quiet evening, after Mrs. Pike had brought Mateo back and he had fallen into a deep sleep, I stood silently over his scratched, used wooden crib. The harsh yellow light from the street lamp outside cast long, protective shadows across his peaceful, breathing form. He was healthy. He was entirely safe, and he was deeply, fiercely loved. I looked down at my son, and the lingering, toxic fog of rejection that had clouded my mind for nearly a year finally lifted. I saw the reality of my situation with crystalline clarity. The man who had walked out the door did not abandon a broken, failed family. He had been standing directly on the threshold of something profound, something deeply and intrinsically meaningful, and he had been entirely too hollow, too remarkably shallow, to recognize its worth. He had chosen the empty, sterile pursuit of a shiny, unencumbered life over the rich, complex, challenging legacy of raising a human being. He did not leave me behind to suffer. He left his own future behind. And looking at Matteo, I knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that his massive loss was my ultimate victory. Time stopped being measured in days and started being measured in milestones of endurance. The exhaustion of single motherhood became a permanent layer of my skin, something I simply learned to wear without complaining. Once Matteo was old enough to attend a subsidized daycare program, I enrolled in evening classes at the regional community college. I chose to study compliance administration. The curriculum was dense, the textbooks were extraordinarily heavy, and the lectures were delivered in windowless rooms that always smelled faintly of floor wax and stale coffee. But to me, those dry technical lessons read like an intricate map out of the wilderness. I studied at the tiny kitchen table, tracing lines of text under the weak light of the range hood while my son slept quietly in the next room. Eventually, I transitioned my focus toward the highly specialized field of corporate risk management. I desperately needed to understand how massive, powerful entities protected themselves from sudden collapse, because I intended to apply those exact same principles of defense to my own fragile universe. My entry into the professional world was entirely unglamorous. I secured a position as a junior file clerk at Harrow and Vale Advisory Group. It was a boutique legal and financial consulting firm, decidedly modest on the outside, but operating with ruthless, terrifying precision on the inside. My daily responsibilities consisted of organizing towering mountains of physical evidence, cross-referencing digital archives, and ensuring that no piece of paper was ever misplaced. In reality, that filing room was my true university. I spent thousands of hours surrounded by the complex architecture of legal agreements. I learned how to read a binding contract, deliberately ignoring the bold, friendly headings and focusing intensely on the buried clauses designed to trap the unwary reader. I trained my eyes to spot tiny financial discrepancies, tracking missing assets through confusing labyrinths of shell corporations and highly creative accounting methods. I learned how to relentlessly follow a paper trail until it revealed the absolute, unvarnished truth of any situation. Through this daily immersion, I experienced a profound realization. The weapon used to destroy my life 19 years ago was not just my ex-husband's inherent cruelty. It was my own naive ignorance of the paperwork I had blindly signed. I made a silent, unbreakable vow to myself right there among the filing cabinets. I swore that no human being would ever hand me a document I did not entirely understand and successfully force me to sign it. As the years accelerated, my son grew into a remarkably quiet, intensely observant young man. Matteo did not demand constant attention, and he almost never threw the typical tantrums expected of growing children. Instead, he simply watched. He absorbed the complex mechanics of our world with a steady, constantly analyzing gaze. He never asked about the glaringly empty space in our family tree, but I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he saw the heavy toll our life took on me. He saw the permanent, dark shadows under my eyes when I was still sitting at the kitchen table reviewing complex case files at 1 o'clock in the morning. He saw me quietly skip my own meals so he could have a second helping of dinner. He noticed everything, storing the information away in his sharp mind. The inevitable confrontation regarding his origin arrived when he was 10 years old. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday evening. I was standing at the sink washing dishes while he sat at the dining table working on his mathematics homework. He had been unusually silent since I picked him up from the after-school care program. Finally, he carefully put his yellow pencil down. He looked directly at me, his dark eyes displaying a level of steadiness that was almost frightening for a child his age. He calmly explained that a boy on the playground had gotten angry during a competitive game and shouted that Matteo was a loser who did not even have a father. I froze instantly, my hands submerged in warm, soapy water. I braced my entire body for the standard, heartbreaking questions. Where is he? Why did he go? Does he love me at all? But Matteo did not ask any of those things. His mind was already too analytical, too laser-focused on discovering the fundamental root cause of the situation. He asked only one, incredibly precise question. Did he know I existed? The air in the small kitchen grew incredibly still, heavy with the weight of the moment. I easily could have softened the blow. I could have invented a tragic, noble lie about a man who somehow lost his way or was tragically forced by terrible circumstances to leave us behind. But I clearly remembered my ironclad vow to never build his life on a foundation of omissions or polite fabrications. I dried my hands thoroughly on a dish towel, walked over, and sat down directly across from him. I looked straight into his eyes. I did not smear Graham. I did not raise my voice. And I completely refused to inject even a single ounce of venom into my tone. I simply delivered the objective truth. He knew. He left anyway. It was a short, brutally unadorned sentence. It held no theatrical drama, no weeping, and no demands for sympathy. It carried only the cold, heavy weight of reality. Matteo did not cry. He held my gaze for a long, silent moment, clearly processing the raw data I had just handed him. Then, he simply picked up his pencil and returned his attention to his mathematics worksheet. That single, naked truth did not break his spirit. It actively forged him into something stronger. It brutally stripped away any lingering, childish fantasies he might have harbored and forced him to mature much faster than his peers. It permanently replaced naive, passive hope with a profound, quiet resilience that became the defining trait of his character. By the time Matteo was 20 years old, that resilience had fully blossomed into a remarkable level of professional and personal competence. He excelled academically at every level, earning multiple full-tuition scholarships that absolutely ensured he would never have to carry the crippling burden of student debt. He possessed a natural, entirely unforced gravity that made people trust him instinctively upon first meeting him. During his summer university breaks, he successfully secured a highly competitive internship at Harrow and Vale. The senior partners at the firm respected him deeply. They did not just respect him because he was intellectually brilliant, though he certainly was. They respected him because he was incredibly, unfailingly steady. He did the hard work. He completely avoided office drama. He never once complained about the hours. And he carried himself with a specific kind of polite, old-fashioned professionalism that immediately commanded trust from corporate adults twice his age. While Matteo was meticulously building his foundation, I was actively cementing mine. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, I steadily clawed my way up from the dusty filing room. Through sheer competence and an absolute refusal to be intimidated by complex legalese, I ultimately became the director of regulatory operations at the firm. The title itself was not inherently glamorous to outsiders. It certainly did not come with glossy magazine profiles or exclusive invitations to elite high society galas, but it came with something infinitely more valuable to me: ironclad, undeniable authority. I became the single person the managing partners implicitly relied on to ensure the entire firm never stepped out of legal bounds. I understood the intricate rules of the game better than anyone else in the building. I had not accumulated the kind of ostentatious, flashy wealth that insecure people desperately flaunt to prove their worth. My wealth was completely quiet. My power was the absolute, comforting certainty that I could never be backed into a helpless corner again. I possessed the financial security and the sharp legal acumen to ensure that no one could ever force me to surrender my agency. Today, my private office sits securely on the corner of the 4th floor, completely enclosed by thick, soundproof glass walls that overlook the busy, sprawling downtown streets. The heavy wooden door has my full name permanently engraved on a brushed steel plate. My chair is ergonomically designed to support my back, and the hot coffee resting on my wide desk comes from a local artisanal roaster, a massive upgrade from the sputtering plastic machine in the old duplex. It is a completely different universe from the drafty apartment and the suffocating, chemical scent of the 24-hour laundromat. Yet, despite the comfort and the undeniable status, I never allow myself to forget the exact price of this piece. Whenever I need a grounding reminder of the solid bedrock beneath my feet, I slide open the bottom right drawer of my heavy oak desk. Tucked safely away, resting quietly beneath pristine organizational flowcharts and highly confidential quarterly compliance reports, is my old, battered spiral notebook. The blue ink I used 19 years ago has noticeably faded into a softer shade, but the 3 distinct words written on the very first page remain perfectly, sharply legible: rent, formula, survive. I look at those 3 words, and a profound sense of calm washes over me. I know that I did not merely survive the wreckage. I took the broken pieces, learned the rules of the world that tried to crush me, and built a fortress that no ghost from the past could ever breach. It was a Wednesday afternoon, precisely 2:30, when the internal phone on my heavy oak desk chimed. My administrative assistant spoke in a hushed, slightly confused tone, informing me that a gentleman was waiting in the main reception lobby. He had outright refused to schedule an appointment, confidently telling her that our meeting was a private family matter requiring immediate attention. I walked out of my glass enclosure and navigated the long, carpeted corridor toward the front of the building. There, standing near the frosted glass entrance, was Graham Mercer. 19 years had passed, and he had entirely shed the skin of the ambitious, anxious young man I once knew. He had aged directly into his wealth. He wore a bespoke charcoal wool suit that draped flawlessly over his frame, clearly tailored to project an aura of effortless authority. His hair was meticulously styled, threaded with expensive-looking silver at the temples. A heavy platinum watch rested firmly on his left wrist, subtly catching the overhead lighting. He brought a new atmosphere into the room with him, a cloying, heavy scent of sandalwood, leather, and the distinct, arrogant presumption of a man who was accustomed to buying his way out of any inconvenience. I did not stop walking until I was a few feet away from him. I did not extend my hand. I simply looked at him, my expression entirely blank, channeling the exact same professional detachment I utilized when auditing a fraudulent corporate account. He smiled. It was a practiced, highly polished expression, the kind of smile deployed at high-stakes charity galas to disarm potential donors. We moved in total silence to a small, enclosed conference room away from the main thoroughfare of the office. I sat on one side of the polished mahogany table. He took the leather chair opposite mine, casually unbuttoning his suit jacket with the fluid motion of someone establishing dominance in a foreign territory. He did not apologize. He did not offer any explanation for the nearly 2 decades of absolute silence. He leaned forward, resting his manicured hands on the table, and deployed his opening tactic. "I want to meet my son," he said. His voice was smooth, carefully modulated to convey a sense of deep, paternal gravity. I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. I immediately recognized the absolute hollow nature of his request. This was not a man stumbling back into my life consumed by the agonizing guilt of his past actions. This was a man who had suddenly realized that the universe was beginning to collect on his outstanding debts, and he was desperately searching for a loophole. "You want to meet Matteo," I repeated, letting the name hang in the air, completely devoid of any welcoming warmth. "Yes," Graham continued, his tone shifting into something a fraction more eager, a little too conversational. "I have been thinking about him a great deal lately. I understand he is a remarkably bright young man. Someone mentioned he is currently interning here at your firm. Is he focusing on corporate governance, or does he lean more toward financial litigation?" The air in the room grew instantly colder. That was not a casual, fatherly inquiry. That was a highly specific, targeted question regarding Matteo's professional utility. A man who simply missed the child he abandoned would ask about his favorite books, his health, or his friendships. Graham was actively probing my son's commercial viability. He had not walked into this building on a sudden, emotional whim. He had commissioned a background check. He had scoured public university records and professional networking platforms. He had prepared for this encounter exactly as he would prepare for an aggressive corporate acquisition. I kept my hands perfectly still on the armrests of my chair, allowing my eyes to drift over him, picking up the subtle, betraying details his expensive suit could not hide. I noticed the way his right thumb compulsively rubbed the base of his left ring finger. The skin there was slightly pale, holding the faint, undeniable indentation of a wedding band that was no longer present. I noticed a faint tremor in his jaw when he mentioned his own business ventures, a microscopic crack in his otherwise flawless veneer. My mind, trained for years to assess risk and connect seemingly unrelated data points, quickly assembled the puzzle. I remembered reading a brief article in a regional financial newsletter a few months prior regarding a major, highly contentious restructuring effort within a prominent real estate development firm in Arizona. It was the exact firm owned by the family of his second wife. Graham was in the middle of a catastrophic crisis. His second marriage was clearly dissolving. The powerful family he had married into was actively freezing his voting shares, strategically pushing him out of the empire he had spent 19 years helping them build. He was suddenly facing the terrifying prospect of being entirely ousted, left with nothing but liquid capital and a severely damaged professional reputation. He had no biological children with his second wife. He had no loyal successor to anchor his position on the board, no legitimate heir to prove his stability to the remaining stakeholders. Then, Graham uttered a single sentence that completely solidified my theory, a sentence that chilled me down to the marrow of my bones. A man starts thinking differently about legacy at my age. Scarlett. He looked directly at me when he said it, his eyes completely devoid of any actual warmth. He did not say the word family. He did not say the word fatherhood. He said legacy. Mateo was not a lost child to be mourned and reconnected with. Mateo was an untapped asset. Mateo was a clean, highly educated, impressive young professional who shared his genetic code. Graham desperately needed a respectable heir to stand beside him, a human shield to legitimize his image and provide him with leverage in his current corporate war. He wanted to claim my son to save himself. I felt a sudden, fierce spike of absolute rage, hot and sharp, threatening to break through my carefully constructed composure, but I ruthlessly suppressed it. Reacting emotionally would give him power. It would allow him to cast me in the role of the bitter, hysterical ex-wife keeping a father from his child. I refused to play that game. "I see," I replied, my voice completely flat, betraying absolutely nothing. "I cannot make that decision for him. Mateo is an adult. I will ask him if he is willing to entertain a conversation with you. I will let you know his response." Graham visibly relaxed, leaning back against the leather upholstery. A faint, arrogant smirk touched the corners of his mouth. He genuinely believed his performance had been flawless. He mistook my calm demeanor for compliance. He thought the terrified, desperate woman he had abandoned in a cheap kitchen 19 years ago was still sitting across from him, entirely too intimidated by his wealth and presence to put up a fight. He thought he possessed the upper hand. I stood up, signaling the immediate end of the meeting. I walked him out to the reception area, offered a brief, utterly dismissive nod, and returned to my office. At 7 o'clock that evening, the heavy front door of my home clicked shut behind me. The house was quiet, filled with the comforting, steady hum of the central air conditioning. I bypassed the kitchen entirely and walked straight into my home office. I bypassed the Daily Mail and the unread emails on my laptop. I went directly to the bottom shelf of the heavy steel filing cabinet tucked in the corner of the room. I unlocked it and pulled out the thick, expandable cardboard box. It was the exact same box I had purchased for $1 all those years ago, now bulging with the sheer volume of history it contained. I carried it to my desk and turned on the bright overhead reading lamp. I did not open it to wallow in old pain or to feed a dormant resentment. I opened it with the cold, methodical precision of an executioner sharpening a blade. I pulled out the original court-mandated child support orders. I pulled out the endless, documented medical expenses, the educational costs, and the thick stack of registered letters his attorney had aggressively ignored for nearly 2 decades. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and a calculator. I began to meticulously tabulate the exact financial weight of his abandonment, calculating 19 years of unpaid mandates, factoring in the maximum allowable state interest rates and the punitive damages for deliberate evasion. My intuition, honed by years of corporate survival, was screaming a clear warning. Graham had not returned to our lives empty-handed. He came armed with an agenda, a deceptive narrative, and a desperate need to consume my son's future to fuel his own survival. He thought he was walking into a simple negotiation. He had absolutely no idea that he was stepping onto a battlefield I had spent 19 years mapping out. I calculated the final number, drew a heavy, dark line beneath it, and closed the folder. I was completely ready. I waited until after dinner to speak. We were standing in the bright, spacious kitchen of our current home, the soft, recessed lighting reflecting perfectly off the dark granite countertops. The quiet hum of the modern refrigerator was the only sound in the room. I was methodically drying a heavy ceramic plate with a linen towel. It struck me then, with the force of a physical blow, the profound, almost poetic mirroring of the universe. 19 years ago, in a cramped, drafty kitchen that smelled of bleach and desperation, my hands had shaken so violently I could barely hold a cheap plastic pen to sign away my marriage. Tonight, my hands were entirely, terrifyingly steady. I placed the dry plate carefully into the upper cabinet, turned to face my son, and told him absolutely everything. I recounted the unexpected afternoon visit at the firm. I described the expensive, perfectly tailored suit, the heavy platinum watch, and the highly calculated, deeply probing questions regarding his career trajectory. I did not soften the edges of the encounter. I laid out the heavy, undeniable implication of the word legacy that Graham had so casually dropped into the conversation. I watched Mateo's face closely as I spoke. I was searching for the microscopic tightening of the jaw, the sudden shift in posture, or the brief flash of vulnerability that would betray hidden anger or unresolved hurt. But there was absolutely nothing. He leaned back against the edge of the kitchen island, his arms casually crossed over his chest, his posture entirely relaxed. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand to know why the man had waited nearly 2 decades to show his face. He simply looked at me, his dark eyes sharp, analytical, and entirely clear, and asked exactly one question. What does he need? The sheer surgical precision of that question took my breath away for a fraction of a second. My son had not been temporarily blinded by the sudden, dramatic reappearance of a ghost. He had instantly and accurately diagnosed the underlying pathology of the situation. He knew instinctively, right down to his bones, that a man like Graham Mercer did not cross a vast desert of his own making unless he was actively dying of thirst. I walked down the hall into my home office and returned a moment later carrying a thin standard manila folder. It was a carefully curated selection extracted from my heavy master archive. I slid the folder across the smooth stone surface of the kitchen island toward him. I did not hand him those documents to ignite a sudden fire of bitter vengeance. I gave the file to him so he would not walk into a high-stakes negotiation completely blind. Mateo opened the folder and quietly reviewed the contents. He saw the cold, highly calculated legal brush-offs from decades past. He saw the completely ignored, certified requests for basic medical coverage when he was a vulnerable toddler. He saw the absolute, undeniable void where a father should have firmly stood. He read the aged documents with the exact same detached, clinical focus he regularly applied to his complex corporate case studies at the advisory firm. When he finally closed the cover of the folder, his expression remained perfectly composed. He agreed to the meeting. However, he completely rejected the notion of a private dinner or a quiet, secluded afternoon coffee. He understood implicitly that isolation was a predator's greatest tactical advantage. In a private, enclosed room, Graham could easily weave a fabricated, highly emotional narrative of profound regret, utilizing false intimacy to manipulate the atmosphere. "Tell him he can meet me on Friday evening," Mateo said, his voice smooth and entirely even. At the Harrow and Vale Autumn Legal Fundraising Reception, it was a masterful, devastatingly brilliant countermove. The upcoming reception was a highly publicized, deeply formal event, hosted at a prestigious downtown venue. It would be heavily populated by senior equity partners, influential district judges, prominent corporate clients, and local financial journalists. It was a space strictly governed by rigid professional decorum, a place where Graham could not throw a sudden tantrum, raise his voice, or twist reality without 100 incredibly powerful, highly observant witnesses watching his every single move. I hesitated for a brief moment, a sudden, powerful wave of maternal protectiveness washing over my chest. I worried about the unpredictable, volatile nature of a public confrontation. I desperately did not want my son's deeply personal history turned into an evening spectacle for the local elite. Matteo noticed the slight, anxious shift in my expression. He uncrossed his arms, stepped forward, and placed his hand gently over mine. His voice was incredibly soft, yet it carried the undeniable, unyielding weight of a hardened steel beam. If he wants to enter our lives in public, let him meet the truth in public too. The very next morning, I arrived at the corporate office a full hour before my usual scheduled time. I bypassed my private corner office entirely and walked straight down the hall to the financial forensics department. I dropped the heavy, master cardboard box directly onto the polished desk of Naomi Cross. Naomi was a brilliant, relentlessly cynical forensic accountant who possessed the terrifying ability to find a hidden, stolen penny buried at the bottom of a dark ocean. I asked her to run a comprehensive, absolutely merciless audit on the 19-year void. I wanted the original, court-mandated child support orders calculated with the compounding maximum state interest rates, adjusted precisely for historical inflation, and stacked relentlessly with every single uncompensated medical, dental, and educational expense I had carried entirely alone. 2 days later, Naomi walked into my glass office and quietly pulled the heavy door shut behind her. She did not look professionally triumphant. She looked deeply, personally disgusted. She placed a sharply organized, heavily tabbed leather binder directly in the center of my desk. She had uncovered a deeply buried, incredibly toxic pattern within the historical financial records. Graham had not merely lazily ignored the court orders out of simple negligence. In the very first 3 years following the divorce, he had aggressively employed a series of obscure, highly technical legal stalling maneuvers. He had constantly shifted his declared executive income into complex, layered corporate shell entities to artificially lower his personal liability. He had actively, maliciously weaponized the slow machinery of the legal system against a young, exhausted mother who was too busy working double night shifts to afford a proper countersuit. He knew exactly how close I was to the edge. He deliberately used my desperate silence, my complete inability to fight a protracted legal war, and intentionally transformed my struggle into a permanent, highly profitable loophole for his own expanding portfolio. He had systematically starved his own blood, not out of passive forgetfulness, but out of cold, calculated financial strategy. The evening of the reception arrived, the air crisp and clear. I stood waiting in the wide hallway of our home, wearing a tailored, dark navy dress that required absolutely no external validation from the wealthy people in the room I was about to enter. I possessed my own gravity now. I waited patiently for Matteo to emerge from his bedroom. When the heavy wooden door finally opened, I felt a sudden, profound swelling of pride tighten my chest, so fierce it nearly brought tears to my eyes. He could have easily chosen his most expensive, aggressively tailored suit to project a manufactured sense of power. He could have worn a flashy, oversized watch or a vibrant, expensive silk tie to silently scream to his absent father that he was highly successful and entirely out of his league. Instead, Matteo chose his absolute simplest attire. He wore a standard, perfectly pressed charcoal gray suit, a crisp white dress shirt, and a plain, dark, unpatterned tie. There was absolutely no flash, no pretense, and no heavy armor. He looked exactly like the grounded, immensely capable, and profoundly secure young man he truly was. As he quietly adjusted his simple button cuffs, his demeanor was entirely beautifully serene. He was not dressing for a desperate, frantic battle to defeat his father. He did not feel the need to conquer Graham Mercer. He was simply dressing to stand firmly in his own absolute truth, stepping out the front door to take his rightful place in the world, and fully prepared to let the other man entirely defeat himself. The heavy brass doors of Sterling Hall opened to a wash of warm, golden light and the low, sophisticated hum of calculated networking. The restored historic building in downtown San Antonio was a cathedral of old money and new ambition. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a highly flattering glow over a vast sea of tailored suits and designer evening wear. The sprawling ballroom was packed with the very architecture of the local power structure. There were senior litigation partners holding crystal glasses of bourbon, hedge fund directors exchanging hushed market predictions, philanthropic board members, and the quiet, deep-pocketed donors who actually manipulated the financial levers of the city. I walked into the grand room with my son by my side. I wore a minimalist, dark silhouette with absolute purpose. I had zero desire to wear aggressive colors or heavy jewelry to announce my arrival. True authority never needs to shout. The profound respect I commanded in that specific room was built on nearly 2 decades of bulletproof compliance audits, relentless risk management, and the silent understanding that I possessed the power to halt multi-million-dollar deals if the paperwork failed my inspection. As we navigated the outer edge of the crowd, several senior partners caught my eye and offered a brief, deeply respectful nod. Matteo walked beside me with an unforced, quiet steadiness. He did not scan the room with the hungry, desperate eyes of a young intern looking for a corporate ladder to frantically climb. He simply existed in the space, comfortable and deeply grounded, which naturally drew immediate, approving glances from the older executives who valued composure over eager ambition. We spotted him almost immediately. Graham had arrived early, which was entirely predictable. He was already deeply embedded in a small, exclusive circle of influential venture capitalists near the main mahogany bar. He was executing his old, familiar social playbook flawlessly. I watched him from a distance for a long moment, observing the cold mechanics of his charm. He knew exactly which hands to shake with a firm double grip, exactly when to lean back and laugh heartily at a mediocre joke, and exactly how to drop the name of a mutual acquaintance to instantly bridge a social gap. He was effortlessly spinning a thick, elegant fog around himself, projecting the absolute illusion of a man entirely in control of a massive, unshakable empire. As soon as he noticed our arrival, he smoothly excused himself from his circle and intercepted our path. He held a small, beautifully wrapped rectangular box in his left hand. He offered a warm, carefully calibrated smile that stopped completely dead just below his eyes. "Matteo," he said, extending his right hand. "I am incredibly glad you agreed to come." Matteo took the hand, gave it a firm, brief shake, and released it immediately. "Good evening," Matteo replied, his tone perfectly even. Graham then presented the velvet box. "I wanted to give you something to mark the occasion, a small token for your promising future in the legal field." Matteo methodically unwrapped the heavy paper and flipped the lid open. Inside rested a custom limited edition fountain pen crafted from dark resin and brushed palladium. Along the silver clip, my son's full name was flawlessly engraved. It was a remarkably expensive item, but far more importantly, it was a highly tactical maneuver. It definitively proved that Graham had deeply researched Matteo's career trajectory, actively trying to buy an immediate, unearned shortcut to mentorship. A lesser young man might have been visibly flattered or deeply intimidated by the gesture. A more emotional one might have rejected it outright, causing an unnecessary public scene. Matteo did neither. He closed the velvet box with a soft snap, slid it smoothly into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, and looked Graham directly in the eye. "Thank you for the gift," he said. The delivery was completely sterile. It was the exact tone one uses to thank a barista for handing over a paper cup. He offered zero emotional foothold. He provided absolutely no opening for Graham to play the role of the misunderstood. Generous father finally coming home to his grateful prodigy, undeterred, Graham seamlessly pivoted to me. 2 members of the local commerce board approached our tight circle. Recognizing Graham from a previous real estate summit, he immediately drew us into their conversation, utilizing us as props. "Richard, Helen," Graham said smoothly, gesturing toward me with an open palm. "I am sure you know Scarlett. We share a very long history. You know how it is? We went through a rather complex transition phase many years ago, but we have always maintained a deep, mutual respect for the sake of our son." I stood perfectly still, letting his audacious, sickening lie hang in the electrified air. He was actively trying to rewrite violent history in real time. He was attempting to sanitize his brutal desertion into a civilized, mutual uncoupling. He desperately needed the local elite to believe that any past unpleasantness was simply a matter of 2 young people growing apart, easily resolved with mature, modern grace. I did not raise my voice to contradict him. I did not sneer. I simply offered the 2 board members a polite, utterly unreadable smile. Silence, when deployed in the right context, is far more terrifying than a scream. As Graham continued to orchestrate the conversation, my eyes drifted over his tailored shoulder and locked onto a woman standing entirely alone near a massive marble pillar. Her name was Jillian Burke. She was a senior business reporter for the most widely read financial journal in the state. I knew for an absolute fact that Jillian had been aggressively tracking a complex, highly volatile file regarding the impending internal fracture of Graham's corporate real estate holdings in Arizona. She was not there to report on the charity auction or the floral arrangements. She was a predator observing the bleeding wounded. Her quiet, calculating presence in that room silently multiplied the risk of every single word Graham spoke by a factor of 10. He was currently spinning a delicate, elaborate web of lies about his incredibly stable family life and his solid legacy, completely unaware that a journalist who possessed the absolute power to dismantle his entire public narrative was standing 20 feet away, carefully watching his lips move. The string quartet in the corner transitioned into a slightly louder, more rhythmic piece. The crowd began to subtly shift toward the center of the room, where the senior partners were preparing to deliver the evening's opening remarks. Graham saw an immediate opportunity to solidify his optical triumph. He turned to Mateo, a look of profound, manufactured pride plastered across his handsome face. He reached out and placed his right hand lightly, yet firmly, against the center of Mateo's back. It was a classic, highly visible gesture of paternal guidance, explicitly designed to be witnessed by everyone in their immediate vicinity. "Come with me, Mateo," Graham urged softly, steering my son toward a gathering of the most powerful equity partners in the building. "There are a few incredibly important people I want to introduce you to." As I watched Graham guide my son forward, radiating the absolute, unshakable certainty of a man who firmly believed he was about to complete the most flawless, victorious comeback of his entire life, I felt a deep, profound calm settle entirely over my spirit. He had built his entire strategy on the assumption that we were too weak to challenge his reality. He was completely, tragically blind to the trap he was walking directly into. Graham steered Mateo directly into the gravitational center of the room. This particular cluster of attendees was not merely wealthy. They were the absolute architects of the local economy. There was a district judge holding a glass of sparkling water, the chief executive officer of a regional commercial bank, and 2 senior managing partners from my own firm. These were individuals who traded in information and leverage on a daily basis. They were exactly the audience Graham needed for his grand, redemptive performance. I shadowed them quietly, stepping into the periphery of the circle just as Graham commanded the floor. He possessed a natural, magnetic cadence that made people instinctively pause to listen. He held his crystal tumbler of scotch in his left hand, the amber liquid catching the light of the chandelier overhead. He raised the glass just a fraction of an inch, a subtle toast to his own impending victory. He placed his right hand firmly on Mateo's shoulder once again, pulling him slightly forward into the spotlight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Graham announced, his voice carrying the perfect blend of polished warmth and profound pride. "I would like you all to meet my son, Mateo. In a lesser environment, perhaps a suburban barbecue or a loud public restaurant. A declaration like that might have been met with immediate, noisy congratulations. But this was Sterling Hall. This was a room constructed entirely of unspoken rules and razor-sharp observation. No one gasped. No one dropped a crystal glass onto the polished hardwood floor. No one shouted in surprise. Instead, the atmospheric pressure in our immediate vicinity dropped instantly. The ambient noise of the ballroom seemed to recede into a distant, muffled hum. The shift was entirely palpable. Several pairs of highly intelligent eyes flicked from Graham's handsome, smiling face directly to me, standing silently just a few feet away. I was a known, respected entity in this building. I was the director of regulatory operations. They knew me as Scarlett Diaz. They knew my son was Mateo Diaz. A few of the older executives, individuals with long institutional memories, suddenly exhibited a faint narrowing of the eyes. They were actively recalling the vague, sanitized rumors from nearly 2 decades ago regarding a young, ambitious executive named Graham Mercer, who had hastily relocated to Arizona under sudden, entirely unexplained circumstances. The math was suddenly being done in real time by some of the sharpest minds in the state. Graham kept his practiced, blinding smile firmly in place, waiting for the murmurs of polite approval. He expected Mateo to lower his head slightly, perhaps offer a modest, grateful smile, and accept his newly bestowed title. Mateo did not lower his head. He calmly stepped out from under the heavy weight of Graham's hand. The movement was completely smooth, entirely devoid of aggressive jerking or dramatic rejection. He simply removed himself from Graham's physical control. He turned his body slightly so he was addressing not just Graham, but the entire circle of silent, watching executives. "I am Mateo Diaz," my son said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed an extraordinary, resonant clarity that commanded absolute attention. "That is the name of the woman who raised me." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket thrown directly over the small gathering. The chief executive officer of the bank paused with his glass halfway to his mouth. The district judge tilted her head, her gaze suddenly sharpening into the exact same analytical stare she used from the bench. Graham's smile fractured. It did not completely shatter, but the edges cracked violently. A dark, frantic panic briefly flared behind his eyes, before he desperately tried to mask it with a forced, patronizing chuckle. He attempted to wave his hand through the air, as if physically brushing away an annoying insect. "Well, yes, of course," Graham stammered slightly, his smooth baritone momentarily losing its footing. "As I was saying earlier, families go through complex phases. There are old wounds, naturally. We are all adults here, and we understand that navigating the past requires a certain level of grace and forgiveness." He was frantically trying to build a narrative bridge, desperately attempting to frame Mateo's statement as the predictable, emotional outburst of a wounded child. He wanted the room to view Mateo as a bitter youth who simply needed time to heal under the magnanimous patience of a wealthy, forgiving patriarch. Mateo completely refused to grant him that shelter. He did not allow Graham to drag the absolute truth into the muddy waters of a daytime family drama. "Biology is not the same as fatherhood," Mateo stated, his tone remaining incredibly light, almost conversational, which made the impact of the words devastatingly heavy. "You gave me one. My mother built the other." The entire group froze completely solid. The air grew so tense it felt as though it could shatter under the slightest pressure. I stood right beside my son, my hands resting calmly at my sides. A sudden, powerful instinct to step forward, to shield him from the intense, burning scrutiny of the crowd, flared within my chest, but I ruthlessly suppressed it. I did not step forward to rescue him. I did not speak up to defend him. I held my ground with the absolute, unyielding posture of a woman who no longer needed to hide from the past. My son was entirely capable of holding his own sword. Graham was actively bleeding out in front of the most important people in his professional sphere, and he knew it. The polished veneer was rapidly melting away, revealing the desperate, cornered man underneath. He had to regain control of the narrative before the silence permanently cemented his humiliation. "Mateo, please," Graham urged, dropping his voice into a low, pseudo-intimate register, entirely ignoring the fact that a dozen people were hanging on his every word. "I am here because I want to make amends. I want to compensate for the lost time. I have built a substantial life, and I want to offer you a place within it. I want to bring you properly into the Mercer family circle. We can start over. We can build a future together." It was the ultimate fatal miscalculation. Graham thought he was offering a magnificent olive branch. He genuinely believed that the promise of wealth, access, and a powerful family name would be enough to wash away 19 years of deliberate, calculated neglect. But in his desperate scramble to save his public image, he had entirely exposed the ugly, mechanical blueprint of his soul. It was not an apology. It was not a confession of profound paternal regret. It was a corporate recruitment pitch. He was offering a merger, an acquisition of a biological asset. Mateo looked at him. There was no anger in my son's dark eyes. There was only a profound, freezing clarity. He saw straight through the expensive charcoal suit, straight through the desperate, sweating charm, right down to the hollow, terrifying emptiness of the man's core. "Do you want a son?" Mateo asked, his voice ringing like a clean, flawless strike against a heavy silver bell. "Or do you want an heir?" It was a surgical strike. A perfectly clean, entirely emotionless blade that bypassed every single one of Graham's defensive layers and cut directly into the absolute black center of his heart. The question hung suspended in the golden light of the chandelier, a blinding, inescapable spotlight illuminating the exact, selfish reason for his return. Graham Mercer did not want a child to love. He desperately needed an heir to deploy. And in front of the very people he had tried to manipulate, that pathetic, transactional truth was laid entirely bare. The silence following Mateo's question was a physical weight in the room. The local executives who had been hovering nearby subtly shifted their weight, taking a collective half-step backward. They were distancing themselves from the blast radius. Graham Mercer, a man whose entire existence relied on controlling the narrative, had just lost his grip on the steering wheel. The mask finally cracked, revealing the raw, frantic panic underneath. He lost his ironclad composure just enough to make a fatal, amateur mistake. Instead of addressing the question with a smooth deflection, he reached out, gripped Mateo by the elbow, and forcefully guided him away from the center of the gathering. He pulled my son toward a dimly lit alcove near the tall, arched windows, desperate to reestablish a private sphere where his manipulation tactics could function without an audience. I followed them. I did not rush, and I did not raise my voice to stop him. I maintained a steady, measured pace, keeping a few feet of distance. What Graham did not know was that before we stepped out of the car earlier that evening, I had given Mateo a very specific piece of advice. I had told him to activate the voice recording application on his mobile phone and slip it into the breast pocket of his suit jacket. This was not a malicious scheme to entrap Graham into a scandalous confession. It was a standard, fundamental principle of risk management. When dealing with a man who had spent nearly 2 decades twisting reality, fabricating legal delays, and rewriting his own history to suit his needs, preserving an objective record of the conversation was the only way to protect the truth. We needed an undeniable shield in case Graham later attempted to distort the interaction to the press or his corporate board. In the shadowed corner of the room, Graham dropped his voice to a harsh, hurried whisper. The polished baritone was entirely gone, replaced by the breathless cadence of a desperate gambler. "You need to listen to me very carefully," Graham said, his eyes darting frantically over Mateo's shoulder to ensure no one was within immediate earshot. "You are focusing on the past, on things that cannot be changed. But if you work with me right now, if we present a united front tonight, you stand to inherit something significantly larger than a bitter, emotional story. We are talking about genuine, generational power." Mateo stood perfectly still, his hands resting easily at his sides, allowing the hidden microphone to capture every single syllable of Graham's confession. Through a rapid, hushed barrage of sentences, the absolute architecture of Graham's plan was finally laid bare. It was exactly as I had deduced from the fragmented financial reports weeks earlier. His second marriage was dissolving, and the wealthy family of his estranged wife was actively maneuvering to strip him of his executive voting rights within their shared real estate empire. They were arguing that he lacked long-term stability and had no legitimate successor to manage his portion of the assets into the next decade. To survive the impending corporate restructuring, Graham desperately needed to present the board of directors with a sudden, irrefutable picture of family continuity. He needed Matteo to be that picture. He wanted to legitimize my son, formally adopting him into the corporate structure, not because he possessed a sudden, overwhelming surge of paternal affection, but because Matteo was the ultimate legally binding prop. My son had not been summoned to San Antonio to rebuild a family. He had been summoned to act as a public relations asset, a highly photogenic shield of stability, and a future signature on a stack of transfer documents. He was a tool specifically designed to legitimize Graham's severely damaged image. "I can give you a seat at the table," Graham pleaded, leaning closer, the scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the sharp smell of his nervous sweat. "I can fast-track your legal career faster than any mid-level advisory firm ever could. We just need to walk back out there, smile, and let them see that the Mercer line is intact and forward-looking. You do not understand how useful this could be for all of us." Useful, the word hung in the air between them, ugly and utterly transactional. It was the final, lethal blow to whatever fragile illusion Graham still thought he was maintaining. I stepped forward, breaking the invisible barrier of their private alcove. "He understands perfectly," I said. My voice was entirely flat, entirely devoid of the righteous anger Graham was likely expecting. "He understands that 19 years ago, he was a liability that threatened your upward mobility, and tonight, he is simply an asset you need to leverage to prevent your downward spiral. The only thing that has changed is your immediate financial necessity." Graham snapped his head toward me, his jaw clenching so hard the muscles in his cheek twitched. He opened his mouth to launch a counterattack, to accuse me of poisoning the boy's mind. But he never got the chance. From the edge of the crowd, Naomi Cross materialized. She moved with the silent, lethal efficiency of a forensic accountant who had just closed a flawless audit. She approached the small cocktail table situated exactly between Graham and Matteo. She did not say a single word. She simply placed a thick, legal-sized manila envelope directly onto the polished glass surface. I stepped up to the table and rested my hand lightly on the heavy paper. "This is not a settlement offer," I told Graham, looking directly into his panicked eyes. "This is a comprehensive summary. It contains the original, court-mandated child support orders from nearly 2 decades ago. It contains the exact calculations of the specialized infant formula, the emergency room visits when he was a toddler, the public school supplies, and the university tuition. It also includes the maximum allowable state interest rates applied to every single missed payment over 19 years. Furthermore, it contains the documented chain of evidence detailing the deliberate legal maneuvers you employed during the first 3 years to artificially hide your income and evade your obligations." I did not raise my voice. I did not throw the heavy envelope at his chest. I simply slid it across the glass table until it rested right next to the velvet box containing the expensive, limited edition fountain pen he had presented to Matteo earlier. The visual contrast was absolutely devastating. On one side of the table sat a luxurious trinket, purchased in perhaps 10 minutes of thoughtless effort to buy a young man's loyalty. On the other side sat an undeniable, physical manifestation of 19 years of abandoned responsibility, meticulously catalogued and legally bound. One was a cheap illusion of fatherhood. The other was the agonizing, calculated reality of his absence. Graham stared at the thick envelope as if it were an explosive device rigged to detonate. The blood entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He realized, in that specific fraction of a second, that I had not brought my son to this elegant room to negotiate a reconciliation. I had brought him here to present an invoice. You walked away because you refused to carry the weight, I said softly, ensuring my words were meant only for him. You do not get to return now and demand the harvest. I did not need to look around to know the exact impact of the scene. Standing just a few yards away, partially concealed by a large floral arrangement, was Gillian Burke. The senior business reporter had not missed a single frame of the interaction. She possessed the sharp, predatory instincts of a veteran journalist, and she had clearly seen the sudden panic, the aggressive pull-away, the hushed, desperate pleading, and finally the delivery of the thick legal file. She did not need to hear the exact monetary figures to understand the absolute catastrophe unfolding before her. She knew instantly that this was not a heartwarming tale of a long-lost father reuniting with his prodigal son. She was witnessing a live, unmitigated public relations collapse. She was watching the total destruction of the exact narrative Graham Mercer had crossed 2 state lines to aggressively sell, and tomorrow morning, the entire financial sector of the city would know it, too. Graham's face flushed a deep, mottled crimson. The suave, calculated businessman evaporated entirely, replaced in an instant by a cornered animal lashing out blindly against the tightening snare. He took a sudden, aggressive step away from the cocktail table, physically distancing himself from the damning manila envelope as if it were coated in poison. He realized the quiet, manipulative whispers had utterly failed, and he felt the absolute control slipping from his fingers. In a desperate, fatal attempt to reclaim the narrative, he raised his voice. It was not a chaotic scream, but the volume was deliberately and sharply calibrated to carry across the immediate radius of the ballroom, specifically targeting the influential ears he felt drifting away from his grasp. "This is entirely orchestrated," Graham declared, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. "You have spent 19 years poisoning our son against me. You deliberately hid Mateo from me. You severed my access, and you staged this pathetic, theatrical spectacle tonight for one single reason. You want to extort money from me now that you see I have built a substantial, highly profitable portfolio." It was the most catastrophic, self-destructive strategic error he could have possibly made. He was deploying a cheap, highly melodramatic defense mechanism in a room entirely populated by apex predators. The individuals standing in our immediate vicinity, holding their crystal glasses and watching the scene unfold with terrifying stillness, were senior corporate litigators, forensic auditors, ruthless venture capitalists, and seasoned business journalists. These were people who spent their entire professional lives dismantling false narratives, reading subtle shifts in body language, and destroying liars across mahogany negotiation tables. They did not hear the tragic plea of a victimized father. They possessed an incredible sense of smell for the truth when it came wrapped in the language of power. They smelled blood in the water. They instantly recognized the frantic, sloppy pivot of a desperate man who had just completely lost control of his own fabrication. I did not flush with sudden anger. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic, vibrating energy, nor did I desperately look around the room to gauge the reactions of the crowd. The time for emotional screaming and desperate pleas had expired 19 years ago on the cold linoleum floor of a cheap duplex in Texas. I simply stood my ground, channeling the absolute, freezing detachment of a senior partner conducting a hostile, high-stakes deposition. "Let us examine that statement," I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried the sharp, ringing clarity of a steel blade striking solid ice. I did not break eye contact with him for a single second. "Give me the exact date of your last phone call. Name the specific month and the specific year." Graham opened his mouth, his jaw working, but absolutely no sound emerged. His eyes darted wildly toward the ceiling, frantically searching his memory for a fabricated timeline that simply did not exist. "Tell me which of his birthdays you attended," I continued, stepping exactly 1 inch closer, deliberately closing the physical distance and suffocating his remaining space. "Which specific hospital bill did you authorize payment for when he contracted severe pneumonia at age 3? Name a single registered letter out of the 42 separate inquiries sent by my legal counsel over the past 2 decades that you actually opened and replied to. The silence that rapidly rushed into the space between us was absolute and entirely deafening. It was far more terrifying, far more violent than any screamed insult or shattered glass could ever be. He stood completely paralyzed under the brilliant, cascading light of the crystal chandeliers. He had absolutely zero answers because the unvarnished truth offered him zero shelter. Every single second he stood there, mute and suffocating in his tailored charcoal suit. The heavy, undeniable silence convicted him in front of the entire elite assembly. Matteo watched the man aggressively unravel with an expression of profound, quiet pity. My son did not look victorious. He did not puff out his chest or smile at the sudden destruction of his absentee father. He simply looked incredibly tired of the empty charade. Matteo reached forward with a steady hand, placed his palm flat on top of the thick manila envelope containing 19 years of unpaid debt and legal evasion, and pushed it slowly across the glass cocktail table. He pushed it until the leading edge of the heavy paper brushed directly against the fabric of Graham's jacket. "If accountability feels like humiliation," Matteo said, his voice incredibly gentle but possessing an absolutely lethal, unyielding weight, "that is not something we did to you." The final devastating collapse of Graham Mercer did not come from my meticulous legal records, nor did it come from my son's quiet strength. It came directly from the very architecture of the corporate world Graham was so desperately trying to manipulate. From the periphery of the silent, intensely watching crowd, a tall, impeccably dressed older gentleman stepped forward, breaking the invisible boundary of our confrontation. His name was Richard Vale. He was a senior, highly influential board member deeply embedded within the family trust of Graham's estranged second wife. He was exactly the pivotal figure Graham had been desperately trying to impress with this entirely fabricated display of stable family continuity. Richard had been standing close enough to hear every single word, to witness the exact moment Graham attempted to weaponize his own abandoned child for a corporate public relations victory. Richard did not look angry. He looked entirely disgusted, possessing the cold, terrifying disdain of an elite executive who had just caught a junior partner attempting to embezzle company funds in broad daylight. "Graham," Richard said, his calm tone instantly dropping the ambient temperature of the room by 10 degrees. "I believe we have seen entirely enough." Graham flinched violently at the sound of the older man's voice. He finally tore his panicked, wide-eyed gaze away from the manila envelope and looked frantically at the senior board member. "Richard, please listen to me. This is a highly distorted, deeply unfair misrepresentation of very complex private family matters. It has absolutely nothing to do with our upcoming operational agenda or the stability of the firm." "It has absolutely everything to do with it," Richard interrupted smoothly, his voice slicing through Graham's frantic, sweating defense like a surgical scalpel. "If you are entirely willing to utilize your own estranged flesh and blood to construct a theatrical, manipulative prop, if you are willing to actively deceive this board regarding your personal stability, then your executive judgment is fundamentally, irreparably compromised. This transparent attempt to manufacture an heir to secure a public relations victory directly impacts my assessment of your basic credibility. I will be sharing my deep concerns regarding your ethical fitness at the restructuring committee meeting tomorrow morning." Richard did not wait for a desperate rebuttal or another pathetic excuse. He turned his attention to me and offered a brief, deeply respectful nod, silently acknowledging the absolute reality and dignity of our position. Then, he simply turned his back on Graham and walked away, disappearing into the elegant crowd. The social contagion was immediate and entirely ruthless. Several other influential figures, individuals who had been happily drinking scotch and laughing with Graham just 20 minutes prior, immediately followed Richard's lead. They smoothly and silently dispersed, physically turning their shoulders away and creating a rapidly widening, socially isolated circle around the panicked executive. Nobody wanted to be photographed standing next to a sinking ship. I stood perfectly still and watched the exact moment the realization hit Graham's eyes. The heavy gilded door he had so confidently intended to walk through to reclaim his vanishing corporate empire had just slammed completely shut right in front of his face. The locks had been permanently turned, and the most devastating, poetic part of his total destruction was that neither I nor my son had to raise a single aggressive finger to push him off the ledge. We did not resort to sabotage, we did not leak rumors to the press, and we did not scream our trauma into the void. We simply stood still, held our ground, and allowed the absolute, unvarnished truth he so deeply despised to crush him completely under its own massive, undeniable weight. The space around us had become a complete vacuum. The elite attendees of the autumn reception had seamlessly and silently withdrawn, creating an invisible, heavily fortified quarantine zone around Graham Mercer. He was standing entirely alone in the middle of a crowded, opulent room, watching the final, desperate fragments of his meticulously crafted salvation turn directly to ash. He tried one last, agonizingly transparent maneuver. The polished, untouchable executive completely vanished, leaving behind nothing but a man frantically treading water. He looked at my son, his eyes wide and pleading, and attempted to inject a forced, tremulous warmth into his voice that he clearly did not feel. "Mateo, please," Graham practically begged, his hands hovering awkwardly in the empty space between them. "Do not let a simple misunderstanding dictate our entire relationship. We can still fix this. We can sit down, just the two of us, and sort through the complicated history. I can make this right. I promise you." When those words left his mouth, they landed on the polished glass table with a hollow, sickening thud. Absolutely nobody standing in the periphery believed he was talking about family or paternal love anymore. They knew, with absolute certainty, that he was talking about his crumbling corporate shares and his vanishing authority. He was not begging for a son. He was pleading for a lifeline to save his own empire. Mateo did not flinch. He did not cross his arms in a defensive posture, and he did not raise his voice to match Graham's frantic, vibrating energy. He simply stood there, a 20-year-old young man possessing 10 times the natural dignity of the wealthy executive sweating profusely in front of him. "You can change your future," Mateo said. His voice was incredibly steady, carrying the quiet, unyielding force of a deep river. "You do not get to rewrite my past." It was the definitive, absolute end of the line. Mateo smoothly and politely declined to accept the limited edition fountain pen, leaving the dark velvet box resting untouched on the glass surface. He explicitly refused the desperate invitations for a private dinner, rejected the offer of a quiet afternoon coffee, and dismissed every single financial promise of future compensation. He did it all without a single trace of bitterness, anger, or venom in his tone. That profound, unshakable calmness was the exact weapon that broke Graham the most. If Mateo had screamed, if he had cursed loudly or thrown an emotional tantrum, Graham could have easily played the role of the tragic victim. He could have played the long-suffering father dealing with an irrational, alienated youth. But my son offered absolutely no such comfort. He offered only cold, impenetrable maturity, leaving Graham with no one to blame but his own reflection. I stepped forward to deliver the final, closing statement to the man who had walked out of a cheap Texas duplex 19 years ago. I did not feel the fiery, suffocating rage I had anticipated for so long. I only felt a profound, sweeping sense of absolute closure. "You did not come back for love," I told him, my eyes locking firmly onto his panicked, wavering gaze. "You came back for leverage. And my son is neither." Graham Mercer finally understood that there was absolutely no angle left to play. He had arrived at Sterling Hall fully expecting to conquer the room, and he was leaving it entirely bankrupt of the one currency that truly mattered in that specific building: credibility. He turned away from us. He did not say a single word of goodbye. He walked toward the heavy brass exit doors through a long corridor of chilling, suffocating silence. The powerful men and women who had eagerly shaken his hand just 1 hour earlier now actively avoided making eye contact, suddenly fascinated by the amber liquid in their crystal drinks or the intricate patterns on the hardwood floor. The expensive fountain pen remained completely abandoned on the cocktail table. However, Graham was forced to reach out and snatch up the thick manila envelope containing the detailed, damning history of his financial evasion. He had to take it, because leaving an explosive, highly documented record of his legal failures sitting in the middle of a premier networking event would have been total corporate suicide. He carried his 19 years of shame out the heavy doors with him, stepping into the dark night alone. By the very next morning, the massive fallout began to rapidly materialize. Gillian Burke, the seasoned business reporter, did not publish a sensational, trashy tabloid article about a dramatic family reunion gone terribly wrong. She was a consummate professional. Instead, she published a sharply analytical front-page piece regarding the impending real estate restructuring. She noted that a severe lack of leadership stability and highly questionable executive judgment were causing major investors to severely reconsider their positions. She did not need to print the sordid, personal details. The professional whispers echoing through the downtown financial corridors accomplished the rest of the destruction. Within 48 hours, crucial equity partners began to quietly distance themselves from his toxic portfolio. The board of directors, controlled by his estranged wife's family, used the sudden, massive loss of his public credibility to significantly tighten their legal conditions, effectively and permanently locking him out of the vast empire he had desperately tried to save. I did not chase his downfall. I did not spend my days frantically refreshing financial news websites to watch him bleed out in the press. I simply handed the thick manila envelope over to the senior litigation partners at my own firm, instructing them to aggressively pursue the outstanding financial arrears through the standard, relentless channels of the legal system. It was no longer an agonizing emotional crusade. It was simply another corporate collection file sitting on a desk. I chose to immediately return to the beautiful life I had meticulously built with my own two hands. I returned to my quiet corner office, my complex compliance audits, and my warm, sunlit kitchen. I returned to a profound sense of peace that required absolutely no validation from the man who had once tried to destroy it. 2 weeks after the reception at Sterling Hall, the invisible media storm surrounding Graham's corporate exile was still raging quietly in the background. But our private world remained entirely untouched. Mateo and I were sitting at a small, slightly battered metal table outside a local, authentic taco stand on the edge of the city. The warm night air smelled wonderfully of roasted pork, fresh cilantro, and charred corn tortillas. We were eating our late dinner under the soft glow of a flickering neon sign. We were not discussing Graham. We were not analyzing the psychological damage of the past or celebrating our victory over a fallen enemy. Mateo was enthusiastically explaining a complex legal precedent he had discovered for his upcoming final university examinations, and I was complaining about a particularly stubborn software upgrade at the office that was slowing down my audits. We were simply talking about the beautifully mundane, entirely ordinary details of our secure existence. I watched my son laugh brightly at a terrible joke I made, his dark eyes completely clear and entirely unburdened by the ghosts of the past. And in that specific, quiet moment, taking a bite of a $3 taco, I realized the absolute magnitude of my victory. This was the true, ultimate revenge. The arrogant man who had once firmly believed he was the tragic, dramatic center of our entire universe had been permanently reduced to a minor, forgotten footnote. He was just a small, irrelevant fragment of a closed chapter. Meanwhile, my son and I were continuously moving forward, living a rich, incredibly full, and entirely solid life that simply possessed no empty space for him to ever occupy again. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, I invite you to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us even further by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.